In the harsh reality of our ancient past, nearly 50% of all human children died before reaching the age of 5. Imagine a world where every single breath a newborn takes is a battle against absolute extinction. How did our ancestors manage to keep such catastrophically fragile infants alive in a world ruled by deadly predators? What secret social technology did they possess that allowed humanity to survive against such impossible odds? You are looking at a biological disaster waiting to happen when you look at a human newborn. Unlike a baby giraffe that stands and runs within 1 hour of birth, a human infant is completely helpless for months. We are born premature by design because our enormous brains cannot pass through the birth canal if they develop any further in the womb. This means that for 300,000 years, our survival depended entirely on a collective strategy. If even one of your direct ancestors had failed at this monumental task just once, you would not exist today. The truth about how they succeeded is not just a list of old survival tips. It is a window into the most sophisticated social behavior ever to evolve on this planet. And it reveals a profound truth that the modern world has quietly abandoned. Let us begin with the fundamental question that almost nobody thinks to ask. Why is human birth so uniquely difficult and physically traumatic compared to other species? When a baby giraffe enters the world, it drops nearly 2 meters directly onto the hard ground. Within 1 hour, that newborn giraffe is standing up and trotting alongside its mother. A baby horse is up on its fragile legs and moving in less than 2 hours. Even chimpanzees, our closest biological relatives, can cling firmly to their mothers immediately after birth. But a human newborn is completely and utterly helpless for months on end. We cannot walk, we cannot talk, and we cannot even regulate our own body temperature. This extreme helplessness is not a mistake of nature or a design flaw. Scientists refer to this unique biological phenomenon as secondary altriciality. It means human babies are born far earlier in their physical development than any other primate. The reason for this dramatic evolutionary trade-off is the sheer size of our brains. Human brains are massive compared to the theoretical limits of our physical bodies. If a human brain were to fully develop inside the womb, the skull would become too large to pass through the birth canal. Therefore, evolution forced us to give birth early as a desperate compromise. At the moment of birth, a human baby possesses only about 25% of its adult brain size. In sharp contrast, a chimpanzee baby is born with about 45% of its adult brain capacity. This means that the critical brain development that takes other animals weeks must take humans several years. And all of this fragile growth must happen out in the open, completely exposed to a dangerous world. This biological reality is known as the obstetric dilemma. It dictates that a human infant cannot survive alone even for a few hours. Our species quite literally cannot reproduce successfully without intense social support. This reality completely redefines the question of ancient human survival. It proves that keeping children alive was never a matter of individual parenting skill. It was an extraordinary achievement of collective behavior, social systems, and group structure. We've all heard the ancient cliché that it takes a village to raise a child. People print it on motivational posters and say it casually at modern baby showers. But in the long history of early human evolution, this phrase was not a metaphor at all. It was a literal, hard-coded biological strategy for the survival of our species. Anthropologists believe this cooperative approach is the primary reason Homo sapiens outcompeted all other hominins. This evolutionary framework is known as cooperative breeding. In most primate species, the heavy burden of child-rearing falls almost entirely on the biological mother. The father might offer occasional assistance, but the mother carries the primary weight alone. This individual burden strictly limits how many offspring a primate mother can realistically raise at one time. Humans broke this rigid evolutionary pattern in a dramatic way. In ancient hunter-gatherer societies, childcare was distributed across the entire social group. This was not done as a casual favor or a pleasant cultural nicety. It was a fundamental structural requirement for how the human group functioned. Within this social architecture, grandmothers played an incredibly critical role. Their contribution was so vital that scientists created the grandmother hypothesis to explain it, developed in the 1990s by anthropologist Kristen Hawkes. This theory addresses a major mystery. Human menopause is extremely unusual and rare in the animal kingdom. The hypothesis proposes that older women evolved to stop reproducing so they could invest energy into their grandchildren. Think about the profound implications of this evolutionary choice. Human females live for decades past their reproductive years because their experience saves lives. Evolution found it more efficient to have older women stop having babies and start keeping grandchildren alive. The hard data from traditional societies heavily supports this theory. The physical presence of a maternal grandmother significantly increases the survival rate of young children. In many populations, it is the single strongest predictor of whether a child survives past the age of 2. But the safety net did not stop with grandmothers. Aunts, uncles, older siblings, and unrelated adults all actively participated in daily childcare. Young children were constantly passed around, held, carried, and watched by multiple adults. When we look at modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Aka of Central Africa, we see this ancient blueprint. AKA fathers are within arm's reach of their infants roughly 47% of the day. 47% is vastly more involved than the average father in modern industrialized societies. The social architecture surrounding an ancient human child was incredibly dense and supportive. The infant was securely embedded in a massive web of relationships rather than isolated with 2 parents. This was not a matter of social philosophy. It was pure survival engineering. Let us look closely at another aspect of ancient life that might make modern audiences uncomfortable. The practice of breastfeeding in ancient times looked absolutely nothing like our modern routines. First, we must consider the incredible duration of nursing. In traditional societies, breastfeeding typically continued for 2 to 4 years, and sometimes even longer. The World Health Organization currently recommends breastfeeding up to age 2 or beyond. While this surprises many people today, from an evolutionary standpoint, early weaning was dangerous. Second, we must look at the astonishing frequency of feeding. Hunter-gatherer mothers breastfed their babies multiple times per hour throughout the entire day. Some studies of traditional groups estimate infants nurse up to 4 times every hour in the early months. This constant nursing provides continuous nutrition and actively regulates the infant's stress response. Crucially, this frequency acts as a natural contraceptive by suppressing ovulation in the mother. This naturally spaced births apart by roughly 3 to 4 years. This specific birth spacing was absolutely essential for the survival of the nomadic family. A mother had to carry and nurse one child to relative independence before she could physically care for another. But the community support went even deeper into the biological realm. The practice of wet nursing, which means breastfeeding someone else's baby, is ancient and universal. Anthropological evidence shows that multiple women in a group would regularly nurse children who were not their own. This collective resource kept orphaned or sick infants alive when their own mothers could not produce milk. It also forged incredibly deep social bonds between different families within the larger tribe. Breast milk was treated as a shared community resource rather than an individual possession. Imagine the practical reality of a hunter-gatherer mother living in the Pleistocene epoch. You must gather food to survive, which requires walking several kilometers every day over dangerous terrain. You must accomplish this exhausting physical labor while keeping a completely helpless infant alive. You cannot simply put the baby down on the ground and walk away. Vicious predators are constantly watching, and hidden environmental dangers are everywhere. Furthermore, a human baby cannot regulate its own body temperature and can die of cold very quickly. And a crying baby left alone acts as a loud acoustic beacon for any meat-eating animal in the area. The elegant solution that ancient humans developed is now heavily backed by modern medical research. Constant physical contact, or what we now call baby-wearing, was the absolute norm for our species. The proof for this practice is written directly into our own physical biology. Human infants are born with an incredibly powerful, instinctive grasping reflex. When you touch the tiny palm of a newborn, they grip your finger with surprising physical force. This reflex is an evolutionary remnant from a time when infants had to cling tightly to a caregiver. Neurologically, The development of the human infant brain is optimized for close physical contact. Studies show that skin-to-skin contact stabilizes an infant heart rate and regulates their breathing. It actively controls their body temperature and lowers dangerous stress hormones. Infants who are carried consistently throughout the day cry drastically less than those who are not. They are not spoiled by this contact. They are simply having a fundamental biological need met. Cross-cultural surveys reveal that in societies where infants are carried constantly, crying is 50% lower. Crying is not an innate personality trait. It is an evolutionary alarm system signaling extreme danger. Ancient human infants spent the vast majority of their waking hours pressed against a human body. They slept in direct physical contact with their caregivers and were virtually never left alone. Modern parenting advice, by sharp contrast, has spent the last century encouraging the exact opposite. We push cribs, separate bedrooms, rigid feeding schedules, and behavioral sleep training. While some of these modern methods work fine, we must realize what we are actually doing. In historical terms, we are running a massive, uncontrolled experiment on our own species. Eventually, the developing baby must transition to eating something other than breast milk. In ancient times, the introduction of solid foods was creative and occasionally disgusting by modern standards. There were no neatly pureed organic carrot pouches or perfectly sterilized baby foods available. There was only whatever food the group managed to gather or hunt down that specific day. The most universal method for softening food for infants was a process called pre-mastication. Adults would thoroughly chew the tough food themselves and then transfer it directly into the infant mouth. This practice sounds deeply shocking and unhygienic to our modern sensibilities. It is entirely true that this process transfers a large amount of bacteria from adult to child. But modern science has revealed a fascinating twist regarding this ancient behavior. Some of those transferred bacteria are actually incredibly beneficial to the developing child. Infants who receive pre-masticated food are exposed to healthy oral microbiota from their healthy caregivers. This bacterial exposure potentially jumpstarts and supports the early development of the immune system. Chimpanzees regularly practice pre-mastication with their young as well. It is an incredibly ancient behavior that is likely as old as the entire human genus. Beyond pre-mastication, ancient children were given calorie-dense soft foods quite early in life. They were fed rich marrow scraped from cracked animal bones, which was easy to digest. They ate mashed plant foods, wild eggs, and tiny pieces of soft fish or meat. This hunter-gatherer infant diet was remarkably varied and nutrient-dense. Research on ancient dental remains shows that hunter-gatherer children had superior nutrition. They actually suffered from far fewer cavities than the early agricultural populations who followed them. Agricultural societies became heavily dependent on starchy grains and bread, which ruined their teeth. It turns out that eating a diverse wild diet is infinitely healthier than eating mostly grain. Now let us look at the ancient human sleep environment, which is vastly different from today. The most important rule of the ancestral sleep environment was that nobody ever slept alone. In every observed hunter-gatherer society, infants sleep in direct contact with an adult body. They do not sleep in a beautifully decorated nursery or isolated inside a crib. They sleep pressed firmly against another human being for the entire night. This universal practice of cosleeping is not a modern counterculture lifestyle choice. It has been the default sleep behavior for roughly 99% of human existence. The strong arguments against bed sharing in modern Western medicine are based on real concerns. There is a legitimate risk of accidental suffocation in soft modern bedding with impaired caregivers. But in ancestral environments, families slept on firm natural surfaces in relatively cool conditions. Under those specific conditions, with sober and responsive adults, the modern risks do not apply the same way. The proven benefits of cosleeping for an infant physical development are extensive. It creates a more stable body temperature and regulates erratic infant breathing patterns. It allows for more frequent nighttime nursing and significantly extends the total duration of breastfeeding. There is also a compelling scientific theory connecting cosleeping to the prevention of sudden infant death syndrome. Anthropologist James McKenna has spent decades studying the microenvironment of infant sleep. He proposes that the sensory stimulation of a sleeping adult breathing helps the infant. The sound and movement guide the infant's own respiratory system during a fragile developmental window. Whether or not this specific theory is fully proven, the broader evolutionary point is undeniable. Human infant physiology evolved expecting constant physical contact during the night. The isolated, separate modern nursery is an incredibly recent and unnatural invention. However, we must remain entirely honest about the brutal realities of human history. For the vast majority of our existence, infant mortality was staggeringly high. In Paleolithic populations, between 30 and 50% of children died before age 5. This terrible loss occurred because ancient humans lacked modern medical knowledge. They operated without germ theory, antibiotics, life-saving vaccines, or modern nutrition science. These modern interventions have driven global child mortality down by 96% since the year 1800. But our ancestors did everything they physically could with the tools available. The deliberate use of medicinal plants is an incredibly ancient human practice. Even chimpanzees self-medicate by consuming specific therapeutic plants when they are sick. The archaeological record shows clear evidence of conscious human herb use going back 50,000 years. Many traditional societies developed highly sophisticated collections of plant-based remedies. Modern medicine is still actively mining these ancient remedies for new pharmaceutical leads today. Willow bark, the original source of aspirin, was used to manage pain and fever for millennia. Natural honey was utilized as an effective antimicrobial wound treatment in ancient Egypt. Raw garlic possesses genuine antimicrobial properties that ancient peoples identified through empirical trial and error. None of these remedies could save a child from bacterial meningitis or severe dehydration, but they helped. Alongside medicine, ancient humans relied heavily on the power of universal ritual. Every single recorded human culture has developed sacred ceremonies around birth and childhood. They created naming rituals, crafted protective charms, and performed intense rites of passage. To a modern scientific observer, these practices might look like pure, useless superstition. But anthropologists argue that these rituals served vital social and psychological functions. They bound the entire community tightly around the fragile life of the newborn child. They publicly and explicitly assigned collective responsibility for the child's ongoing welfare. Furthermore, they provided a vital psychological framework for processing deep grief when children died. The archaeological record proves that ancestral grief was real, profound, and devastating. Infant burials at ancient sites are arranged with immense care, grave goods, and flowers. The cold idea that ancient humans were indifferent to the death of their children is completely false. They tried, they mourned deeply, and they slowly accumulated empirical knowledge across millennia. Now we must face the most unexpected and provocative truth of this entire story. A large portion of what ancient humans did to protect children was superior to what we replaced it with. We must be absolutely clear that modern innovations like clean water and vaccines are non-negotiable. The near-total collapse of child mortality in the 20th century is one of our greatest achievements. Nobody is arguing that we should return to a world where 40% of children die. But within the specific domain of behavioral, social, and emotional childcare, we have stumbled. Industrialized societies have dismantled deep evolutionary structures without understanding their true value. We've shattered the extended family network that once distributed the exhausting burden of childcare. In many modern nations, families are reduced to an isolated nuclear structure or complete geographic isolation. We replaced constant physical contact during the day with mechanical bouncers, swings, and playpens. These modern devices are explicitly engineered to keep a baby quiet without requiring human touch. We replaced the supportive communal sleep environment with an isolated, separate nursery. We have developed a strange cultural anxiety around infant dependence that is evolutionarily bizarre. This modern isolation is not a moral failure on the part of modern parents. It is the inevitable product of massive economic shifts, urbanization, and two-income households. These societal changes occurred for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with child welfare. Modern parents are trapped navigating these unnatural systems and are doing the best they can. Yet the rates of postpartum depression, infant sleep disorders, and parental burnout are historically high. When you compare the isolation of a modern parent to the dense social web of our ancestors, the gap is terrifying. The ancient, proven answer to how you keep a catastrophically fragile child alive was simple. You do not attempt to do it entirely alone as an isolated individual or a single couple. You do it as a cooperative group. You share the massive physical load, and you distribute the deep exhaustion. You ensure that no single adult is ever the sole point of failure in a child's survival. That is not a romantic philosophy. It is brilliant survival engineering. How did ancient humans keep children alive through 300,000 years of hardship? They carried them constantly against their skin and breastfed them for multiple years. They slept directly next to them every single night and chewed their solid food for them. They surrounded them with a dense, highly attentive web of dedicated grandmothers, aunts, and friends. They took genuine, shared responsibility for the fragile welfare of every single child in the tribe. They mourned deeply when children were lost, and they tried to fight illness with the limited tools they had. They developed sacred rituals to hold their communities together in the dark face of grief. They accumulated precious empirical knowledge across generations and passed it forward as tradition. The golden thread that runs through all of human history is beautifully clear. Children survive and thrive when they are embedded in deep, continuous human connection, and they suffer immensely when they are structurally isolated from the group. That is not just ancient history. It remains completely true for us today. We have built miraculous technology to keep our children physically safe from disease and starvation. We have made historic progress against the biological threats that once killed half our species. That progress is genuinely, profoundly, and undeniably good for humanity. But the social technology, the dense, overlapping network of distributed human care, is fading. Our ancestors spent hundreds of thousands of years building that cooperative human network, and that is the exact piece of our ancient heritage we are still struggling to preserve today. Ancient humans did not possess modern antibiotics, advanced ultrasounds, or pediatricians. They did not have infant formula, specialized car seats, or sterile modern apartments. What they truly had was each other. And it turns out, for the things that matter most to a human soul, that was more than enough.